Hey everyone, this is Eric Chabot here, and I am the director of Ratio Christi Student Apologetics Alliance at The Ohio State University and Columbus State Community College here in Columbus, Ohio. And we are a nationwide ministry. We're all across college campuses. I also have a blog called thinkapologetics.com and a small social media presence. And I'm also the Midwest representative for CGF Ministries. So I am going to talk to you a little bit today about how to talk to people who say they can't know if God exists or they don't know how to know if God exists. People that are mostly on the agnostic side of things. I would say on college campuses, I see more students who are agnostics and atheists. Sometimes they say they're atheists, but actually when you walk them through it, they're really agnostic. And they just make comments like, well, I just don't think we can know. There's no way to ever know. I don't know how we would know if God exists, or how would we know if Christianity is true? So the first thing I do when someone brings this up is ask them a question back. I say, would you like to know if God exists? Is it something that's important to you? Because as my friend Frank Turek says, some people are on a happiness quest or a truth quest. That means that some people are not really seeking truth. They're simply going through life and all they're trying to do is just do everything they can to be happy all the time. Not that happiness is a totally bad thing, but the issue is that they're not really seeking truth. They're not truth seekers. So I have to find out if they're really on a truth quest and whether this question is really important to them. So that's the first thing I do. Secondly, when they say they can't know or they don't know how they can know, how they would know if God exists, well, that is really another way of saying they don't know how to have knowledge of God. They don't know what approach to take to gather knowledge of God or to actually say that I have knowledge that God exists. So I walk them through that and I say, you're really saying that you don't know how to have knowledge of God. Therefore, the question I would ask to them is, how would we gather knowledge of God? How would we attain knowledge of a personal God? What approach should we take? Well, an analogy can be used in human relationships because anytime we enter into a human relationship, it generally takes initiation, meaning that you email somebody, you talk to them, you speak to them, you text them, you call them. One way or the other, hardly any relationships are formed without one of the individuals taking the initiative to reach out to the other person to communicate in some way, right? And there's no way that anybody would know anybody. No knowledge of someone would be revealed, right? Unless someone would take the initiative to reveal what they're like to somebody else. They initiate that relationship. So by way of analogy, if we think about God, one of the primary ways, as we know, the way that he gives us knowledge of himself is through revealing himself, right? God has to take the initiative to communicate to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't know what he's like or who he is. And so we believe God has given us knowledge of himself through the natural world, meaning that we can look at cause and effect relationships. We can make inferences and look at an effect and ask what's the best explanation for that effect, or what's the best explanation for some data that we observe, whether it be in the biological realm, in cosmology and physics or astronomy or some other field. But the point is that God has given us knowledge of himself, that he is there through the natural world. Of course, Paul talks about this in Romans 1. He says that God's attributes are clearly seen through the things that have been made. That means that we can look at the creation and we can make an inference that there is a creator, okay? Now, of course, all those arguments have to be unpacked one by one. Stephen Meyer does that brilliantly in his new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, and there's been other books out there that have been written about this, about arguments for God in the natural world. But the point is that God has to take the initiative to give us knowledge of himself. And one of the ways we know that is through knowledge in the natural world, through knowledge of his effects in the natural world. We know there's a God by the effects he has left here for us to observe and make inferences about what's the best explanation for the things that we observe. Another way God gives us knowledge of himself, of course, is through history. And that means that we need to be open to the fact that God has communicated somewhere in the world of history. He has done something to reveal what he is like in a specific time, a specific place, through a specific people group, or through a specific person. Of course, in our case, we believe he has revealed himself through the nation of Israel. He has given us a text. Of course, God has decided to give us a text to read about how he interacted with Israel and what he did in the lives of all those Jewish people. And of course, we ultimately believe that God has brought someone into the world who is the full revelation of who he is. And that, of course, is Jesus. And so we believe when we are investigating the person of Jesus and listening to what he's saying, that Jesus is communicating to us what God is like. He's communicating to us the fact that there is a God, and secondly, that he is the spokesman for God, of course. So we need to be open to the fact that God would pick history as a way to communicate to us. Now, some people will say, some agnostics will say, well, that's not good enough. You know, I want something more supernatural. I want some God to speak to me directly. I want him to write it in the sky. Or I want a sign that's so clear that I can say, that's God. And if that does happen, I'm going to bow my knee and I'm going to follow him and I'm going to commit my life to Jesus. Well, let me say over the years that most people that make that claim don't know what they're talking about. And they don't know what they're asking for, because there's no guarantee that if God did do something that was more miraculous than whatever you consider miraculous to be, whether it be one of those things I just mentioned, there's no guarantee that you're going to yield your life over to God or yield your life over to Jesus. Because remember, Jesus did a lot of miracles in the New Testament. There's other miracles in the Bible. Remember what happened to Israel after they came out of Egypt, after God parted the Red Sea. Then they ended up worshiping a golden calf and they went right back into idolatry. So, you know, you may just, even if you got that sign you wanted, you may just give God the middle finger. You may think you're hallucinating. You may really not be interested in really committing to God, because there's no guarantee that's going to move your will to yield to God, because faith involves our intellect, our emotions, and our will. Okay, we can have all the evidence in the world and all the intellectual arguments. That doesn't mean those things are going to move our will, right? Volitionally. So when it comes to talking to people or agnostics about, you know, knowledge of God, the ones that say they don't know or can't know, what I'm trying to do is give them a way to approach the existence of God. They don't really know what method to take. And so I have to walk them through it to say, what would knowledge of God look like? What do you consider, knowledge of God? What would God need to do to communicate to us, to give you knowledge of himself? What do you think he should do? Can this God communicate through things he's made? Can we look around the world and say, okay, I can see knowledge of God. I can gather knowledge of God, what he's like, by looking at things in the creation? Or can we look into history and we do it that way? The point is that we need to be open to the ways God has communicated to us. And quite frankly, if you think that you're entitled to a different method, that means you're rejecting the various ways God has communicated to us, as we could go over many more of them, but I mentioned a couple. If you think that you're entitled to a better way, a different way, then you'll have to have that argument with God. But like I said, nobody that I know that has ever asked for a sign or saying they need a sign has ever admitted to me that they will yield their lives over to God or to Jesus if that sign happened. And if they do admit it, if they say they will, they're assuming that they know how they would respond to such a miraculous sign. They're making a big assumption. So in the end, perhaps God knows something that you don't know, okay? Well, anyway, I hope this helps you in talking to people who are agnostic. You're going to encounter a lot of agnostics out there, a lot of people that say they just can't know if God exists, but the question is, do they want to know? Have a good day.